So we'd like to open this up now for questions.
So mine's really more of a comment. I just love the fact that you guys are like founding new territory. And I see it, as you said, as much of a parallel to trying to find the way forward in our country. And so I really appreciate that. Thanks.
I have a question about how much freestyle, in hip hop, you do have the songs that are sold like on recordings, but I know he's writing the music, but do you have the ability to also freestyle and take it somewhere else?
That's a really good question. Do you freestyle? Yeah, I could tell. If a freestyler would ask that question. Full transparency, like oftentimes I'll speak for myself, like I'll get caught up on some of my words and just forget what I'm saying. So I have to kind of like be in the moment and freestyle. But the thing about this music that's a little bit different from like the 4-bar kind of like loop rap stuff is it's very like you have to be in the pocket. You know what I'm saying? You can't kind of like feel your way through it because it'll switch to a totally different mood or totally different time signature. So it's harder to freestyle. But as as I get more comfortable and intertwined with the compositions, it becomes like like you catch more of the idiosyncrasies, so you kind of know how to get in the pocket a little bit better. But it's better to just like write and follow the music. You know what I mean?
Can you comment on the show Hamilton as an amalgamation?
Hamilton. I mean, I have a problem with the premise of Hamilton from jump. But foregoing that, because that's like a long talk, and we only have so much time. Look, I'll say this. I think it was something that was very well executed. As something that's a performance art. I also am very aware of a lot of the artists who were actually in there who are writers themselves. But the whole thing was just kind of written by one individual. So I don't know how much of an amalgamation it actually was, even though there was like an orchestra there. I would say that's very much different than what we're doing, because it involves a combination of many different perspectives. And so there's not just one. So there's a perspective that's brought through the writing of his music. There's a perspective brought through our lyricism. And then there's also a conversation, even a debate, that we have often in terms of how we execute this, how we present it, how we speak on it. So like Hamilton isn't as much as that. It's kind of more of one person's perspective who came up in hip hop culture. And so I would say it's a little different than what we're doing.
So 15, 20 years ago, I used to go to Amoeba, Tower Records, warehouse to find my music or hear it on the radio. These days with the internet, has that experience made it more difficult or better for you to get your music out there? Because I know you're discovering a lot of good music, but you're also finding a lot of trash music. So just...
It's interesting that you asked that, because that seems to be that type of question seems to kind of come up in both sides of the camp of, the glory days of when, said music could do said thing, and that was its thing. So, yeah, I mean, brick and mortar stores, they're pretty much kind of going out of business, and then you have the uprise of vinyl now, which is kind of coming back or is back. In general, I don't think people really buy physical stuff as much unless they're absolutely in love with said group. So for us, when we came up with our very first album, we actually did a Kickstarter campaign on it, and it was very successful. So much so that this one young gentleman, he really liked the Kickstarter, showed it to his dad. His dad contacted us. It turned out that his dad was the music director for ESPN. And so after about a couple of years going back and forth in terms of how we could work together, the Super Bowl 50 was suddenly coming to the Bay Area. So he's like, hey, I still love you guys. Why don't you guys do something for ESPN? So we could, feature the Bay Area, feature you, all the good things. So for Super Bowl 50, we were asked to reimagine California Soul. That was the very first song that you heard when you guys came in here. And it was featured, during the playoffs and, on television, and so it's been featured all over the place. And so I think with the internet versus brick and mortar stores, you do have more opportunity to reach people that wouldn't have any right to suddenly fly, 64 hours to see you randomly, because they can just, click a button and there you are. It has given us opportunity for people to fall in love with aspects of us that they wouldn't necessarily like. So, for instance, some people like our live shows a lot. Some people are polarized by live shows because you have those two different cultures hitting you in the face. And then some people like our videos. So whatever angle a person comes in is the angle that they'll then suddenly kind of fall in love with, fall in love with the music, fall in love with the group, and kind of fall in love with the idea of what we're doing. So I do think digital media has been great for us. I do think it is still great for musicians in general because it gives everyone an opportunity to do something. Now, that's not talking about skill level, I mean, I can go really deep into this because I was teaching voice for a while, and I had to stop because it was just like too much. Like everyone wanted to be super famous. I'm like, okay, you have to do X, Y, and Z first. There's this thing of singing in tune first. So, but yeah, just to answer your question in a very simple way, yes, I do think digital has been very helpful for us and for other musicians in general. So.
Hi, I love both hip hop and classical, so thank you so much for doing what you do. I like what you were saying about this mutual contribution idea that hip hop is contributing to classical and classical is contributing to hip hop. I'm wondering how bringing those two together has changed the way you think about or approach your respective crafts.
That's a very good question because, the reason I said this is not classical music doesn't mean that I'm doing hip hop actually, because what that means for me, new concert music is that performing arts at large right now is dying. So it's not necessarily hip hop that is classical music. Hip hop is fine. They're doing fine. They're mumbling and they're doing triplet rap and it's selling out the stadium. So it's being supported by people. But classical music, by being very, very specific in its aesthetic, has failed everybody now, even the practitioner of classical music. And so symphonies now try to do a different presentation. They do like a Jaws movie and then like orchestra's playing and you sell out. But then, 2 weeks after they will do Mahler, nobody comes. It's the same kind of thing because the aesthetic of Western European sort of Eurocentric and very post-colonial idea has ended. And then right now, again, there's no other story because that's why the right is saying, okay, we got to go back. It's like, well, go back where? There's nowhere to be gone, right? So are we going back to slavery? Are we like Roman times? Or what are you talking about? So here, what really changed for me is that I decide to base all my aesthetic sort of consideration for writing on hip hop, which is method sampling. So that's my conversion.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, the reason why I was interested in this project in the first place was because, one, I just wanted to be, I just thought being with a live band was great. Having done it before in like different spurts, it was always just like a really vitalic experience. But what it also has done is made me think about, my writing way more technically. So when I was doing hip hop, when I was just writing to, 4/4 time signatures, it was just, what I'm saying? It was something organic. I mean, hip hop came out of just organic, vital expression, right? With kids who had nothing. You know what I'm saying? So like there's they didn't come up with any techniques or manuals or teachers. It was just people in a space collectively doing their thing. Somebody saying like, oh, that's incredible. I'm gonna learn how to do that. Then I'm gonna do it better, or I'm gonna do more, right? And then that's the proliferation of the art form, or how it proliferated, especially before it was commercialized. But made me think of it more in a technical manner. So now I think of like when there's build-ups in the music, right, where all the instruments are going and I have to get louder. Well, how do I be louder without like yelling or straining my voice? Where I'm like, okay, I started studying a little bit of linguistics, where I found out about different the sonority of vowel sounds, right? And so when they were build up of music, I'll use more ahs and uhs and ahs because they're more sonoric, right? And so, and then also, Juwan writes a piece and he's like, right here it goes from 4/4 to 5/4 to 2/4 to 5/4, and I'm like, why would you do that? Why would you do that? But I'm like, okay, I'll write to it. And then I wrote something that I really liked and I thought was incredible. And so I'm like, oh man, that's good. If you do it again, I'm good, But before I was like, this makes no sense to me. Why are we switching time signatures in the middle of a verse? And so, yeah, it made me think of, my craft differently.
So as an educator of hip hop, would you like to add to this?
I'd like to, but again, Ed took everything I was going to say. It has made me more of a dramatic performer. My intention, we speak on intention. My intention anytime that I put pen to paper or step on a stage is I want my intention to be felt. I want it to affect folks. And Ensemble Mik Nawooj and Juwan's composition has afforded me a very wide palette to give my expression and to invite people into to my thought process. So.
I was curious, as you're talking about bringing different communities together and creating this space so that people who might not have in the past listened to hip hop or classical having the opportunity to. And I'm wondering how you're pre-event reaching out to these different groups who communicate very differently and letting them become curious or interested and feel like it's a safe space.
So we started doing this about 8 years ago. And when we first started, we had a publicist mainly gearing this toward like a classical crowd. And the first show was pretty successful in terms of people coming. Subsequent shows were not as successful, so we fired him. And so then we tried to have other people take, and then I just kind of was like, you know what? I'm just going to do this because it's very simple. People will gravitate toward something if you give them a reason to come to it. So we started, saying this very simple thing, hip hop orchestra. And it sounds very, very simple, but my intention behind it was that we're saying without saying that there are two completely different cultures that are coming together that you've probably never heard together, but it actually works. So in doing so, we developed such a strong relationship with press in the East Bay that it was so bananas that we were on East Bay Express consecutively for 2 or 3 years. And going into the third or fourth year, they were like, look, we love you guys. Everybody here at the office loves you, but we can't write about you we need at least a 6 month to a year break. I was like, okay, that's totally fine. So then we've been on just about every publication in the Bay Area. We have a great relationship with NPR, other actual hip hop magazines. We just developed a relationship with Four Doors Travel, Chill Magazine. Everybody kind of knows me and kind of knows EMN when it comes to press. And we also make great relationships within the community as well, because we are a nonprofit performing arts organization. So we do write a lot of grants and do a lot of free programming, in different art galleries and other nonprofit-ish performing arts venues in the area. So a lot of this has been an organic growth in terms of building our audience and getting people comfortable with who we are and what we do. And we do have a large output of video footage. As I mentioned before, how digital has been very helpful to us and to artists in general. And we're constantly growing and kind of moving forward, and still never forgetting that we're from Oakland and we always try to do things here in the Bay Area. And kind of segueing into that, in November, we're going to be doing a multidisciplinary program with Crowded Fire Theater, Axis Dance Company in Oakland, and Ensemble Mik Nawooj. So it's a multidisciplinary piece called Death Become Life. And so essentially it will include integrated dance with able-bodied and disabled-bodied dancers, and a loose theatrical narrative set to a theme that Juwan came up with. And now the crazy thing about this is that it's what we call a modular piece. So what you'll see in November is something that's going to reflect Bay Area culture and ethos, but it's going to be very different than what you would see when we produce something in like Hong Kong or Australia or Detroit. Each iteration of the program will always reflect that region's culture, and we'll always be using that region's musicians and artists to flesh out that narrative. So that's going to be November. It's going to, as I mentioned, Death Become Life, and kind of to come back to your original question. Yes, we always try to develop great relationships in our communities, and then also with the press of those communities, and always kind to expand in an organic way.
So in college, I did a lot of independent study on the history of hip hop and the way that it manifested. At the time, I'm old, so it's a long time ago. And one of the things that came up was call and response, how important it is in hip hop. And for me, my thesis was about the beat, how important the beat is, how fast it is in terms of creating unity. So I'm curious about what other sampling methods you use in your compositions, because you're talking about two different ensembles historically, right? Like the orchestra is an ensemble and hip hop is usually an ensemble. So what are the other elements that you sample?
The ensemble's instrumentation is copier ensemble. What that means is that there was a composer named Schoenberg, and then he did a piece called Pierre Lunaire, which included instrumentation of flute, clarinet, violin, cello, some sort of singer, some sort of percussion. And we're basically using that because a lot of 20th century contemporary ensembles that are like cutting edge are using that to build their own agenda. And I hate their agenda. So I wanted to use exactly the same sort of setup and add drums, trap set, and then MCs to sort of reframe that. So a lot of my ideas is actually reframing and meta sampling. So I would use techniques like counterpoint pretty rigorously, but then I would follow 16 bar if it is necessary. And if I think that the 16 bar normal hip hop format is kind of not working after a certain point, I will change it up more using classical rationale.
Thank you all. Can everybody give them a warm round of applause? Thank you so much.